Hello and welcome again to the Room of Lives. This final part of the conversation is my take on the nature and rules of the cosmic game that I suspect life is. We start with the question of whether there really are other players in this game, or is a single being simultaneously playing as all of them? Moreover, is the simulation itself ultimately separate from the player? Here we draw a connection with Maya, the Hindu idea that the world and its multiplicity are an illusion with which Brahma, pure awareness, deceives itself, enters as the world and its inhabitants, all with the ultimate purpose of regaining true self-knowledge and returning to oneness. I back this story up with some scary visions I had when I was younger. We expand on a Buddhist quote about our beliefs being more substantial than our experiences, and discuss the Hindu principle of Advaita Vedanta that all separateness is an illusion. But if all players in the game are ultimately one, what would happen to the notion of free will? And does it square with our observations and experiments about free will and thought? We mentioned Shunyata, the Buddhist idea of the emptiness underlying the diverse worldly phenomena, and look anew at death in light of this cosmic game. I share my views on the purpose of the game being deliberately difficult, related to the dissolution of the separate identity, which is a source of both great fear and great liberation. I suggest how the teeming richness of life at all levels, not only in material but also psychological laws, and the complex paradoxes of our choices and outcomes, suggests the entire world as a personal, interactive, deliberate manifestation of life, rather than a vast, inert, impersonal desert where the only source of sentience and intelligence is ourselves. How did ancient cultures such as India, completely unfamiliar with today's technologies of computer games, virtual reality, and simulations, come up with the simulation theory of the world? Could it be due to individuals briefly waking up from this cosmic illusion? And is that happening even today? Finally, we discuss how this game of life appears to be positive sum, and that love may play a surprisingly fundamental role. If you enjoy visiting the Room of Lives, consider supporting me by donating DAI or Ether to abhranil.eth. That's ABHRANIL.ETH.
Oh, well, hey there, Neil. How's it going?
Pretty good. I didn't go to work today. Sad stuff to do. But okay, so we are here. We're doing the second part of what we thought would be a one-part episode to be finished in 3 hours. And when I said 3 hours, your eyebrows went up a little bit, like 3 hours. Are you sure you're gonna need 3 hours? We needed 3 hours yesterday to do half. So here we are. We're going to do the second part of whether or not the question is life a simulation? And in the first part, we kind of mostly talked about, or what I mostly talked about was my gradual lifting or easing of certainty about what I think reality is, especially in the last couple of years of my life. And so in this part, we're going to talk a little bit about are there any new things that I believe? Like, has the model not simply eased but altered in some way? And if it has altered, what kinds of clues or information or experience has guided this alteration? So I'll be talking a little bit about that. I'll be talking about some personal experiences, and I will be talking about ideas mostly but not exclusively from Eastern traditions that I have encountered that kind of have started making increasing sense. So we'll be talking about some of these ideas a little bit. And then at the very end, we will be talking a little bit about the nature of, if this is a game that we find ourselves in, what is the nature of the game? Okay. That's it. Okay, let's start. So we kind of discussed yesterday about, we have this very solid scientific certainty about the nature of reality, which we noticed that it sometimes extends beyond the bare proof. And that I increasingly think is a scientific dogma. It's a dogma of its own in science. And so if we were to just sit and just think clearly for a moment, we will see that there really isn't any evidence available to us that can help us discriminate between whether or not this is a simulation. And questions like, does consciousness really, is it really generated in the sense of generation, like causal generation? Is it generated by this thing that we call the brain? Or is evidence of activity in the brain simply stuff within the simulation that's correlated with how I feel in my body or in my emotions, etc.? So stuff like that. Okay, so so scientifically, the simulation theory does not really contradict our experience of reality, but that does not suffice to create a complete model of a theory. It's just a speculative hypothesis. Things that are still remaining to be investigated or answered, if it is a simulation, are very basic questions like, so there appear to be different players in the simulation. There's me, there's Benam, there are other people. Are these really other players playing the simulation like some sort of weird shared dream? Or are they all part of the backdrop of the dream? And do they even exist or not? Am I the only player? What is this simulation running on? Like, what is the physical nature of the simulation? The virtual nature of the simulation is our life. We are in the simulation. But what is the nature of the simulation in whatever world it's running? And we can ask questions like, okay, what hardware is it running on? But that's a question that's so strongly loaded by the intuitions of this world that's not, I mean something more general. Like, if this is a simulation, looked at from the point of view, in the world where the simulation is running, what kind of simulation is it? Is that embedded in a world that ultimately turns out to be a higher simulation? Is it an infinite regress, etc.? Who's the creator of this simulation, or what is the purpose of the simulation? So let's start with one of these questions. So the idea of solipsism is that, as far as I understand it, that there is no evidence or no way to know that any other consciousness besides yours actually exists. So you never know if other people are real. Yeah, you never know if other people are real. And that's kind of part of what I'm trying to say here is, how do we know that there are other players in the simulation? And if there are no other players, it becomes a little easier to understand a simulation, because current day humans are already working towards or have partially designed simulations in which a single human player can enter. And although there appear to be other players in the game, they're not really other players. They're like simulations of other players. But I think in the near future, we will be able to envision or even experience simulations in which multiple humans can enter at the same time, and the computer that's running the simulation will incorporate all of these users into a shared story, and you will be able to interact with characters who represent other humans in the simulation. Another interesting way that this could develop, and we'll see why it's particularly interesting to our particular discussion in the context of Maya and the Hindu traditions is that you could imagine, okay, so when a human enters a simulation, these days the way they do it is through input-output devices. But brain-machine interface technologies are going to quickly improve in the next few years. Elon Musk founded a whole company called Neuralink, whose ultimate purpose is to deliver consumer-grade brain-machine interface products within the next decade for reasonable prices. So there's definitely a huge thrust towards this. And you can imagine that as simulations get better, they'll eventually upgrade themselves from input-output based interaction with the user to direct reading and writing from the brain. And then you'll be able to leverage many more sensory input-output streams, etc. But one interesting thing that you can do is if a simulation is directly, or the computer algorithm is directly talking to the brain, then you could use different, let's say, motor nerves or different kinds of nerves of the brain to write commands to different players in the simulation. So for example, as a human player, I could simultaneously be controlling 3 different players that are interacting amongst themselves in the game. In the same way that humans have already learned to control prosthetic limbs, etc. So what happens in that case is that there's some sort of a reader that reads electrical signals from a certain set of neurons in the brain, and these are neurons that are usually kind of responsible for moving that arm in the first place. So the humans kind of intuitively know, or like subconsciously know, how to send appropriate signals to those neurons in order to make their arm move. Now they haven't used that part of the brain for a long time, maybe because their arm got cut off, but after this prosthetic limb is attached to them and the connection is made to these neurons, the human can start issuing those commands again by imagining that they're moving their arm as they did before. Over a period of calibration, the brain kind of synchronizes with the machine, or the machine learns how to interpret the commands, and they can learn to move their arm. You can take a different subset of the neurons of the brain of this patient and attach it to something else, some other robotic prosthetic. So in the way that different parts of the brain can simultaneously, in the same way that I'm just using my hand, both my hands to gesture at the same time, the brain is capable of simultaneously interacting with different parts of the world. So if you imagine these different parts of the world as being different characters in a simulation, the same person can enter a simulation of, let's say, a town full of people, each of which has much lower intelligence than the human player, and simultaneously control them.
So with that idea, then you're not supposing that, like, for example, the human's brain to adapt to multiple novel outputs like prosthetic limbs is indefinite, but rather you could theoretically imagine something like orders of magnitude more complex than a human brain having been broken down into constituent parts like multiple people.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't imagine that the human brain's capacity to simultaneously control and interact with various external subparts is infinite. There's like a finite limit to it. But that's just a property of the human brain. Also, I don't think we really understand the limits of the human brain very well, especially in regions where it hasn't been formally tested before, like in areas of interacting with artificial external objects. The human brain is just kind of famous for, you make some prediction about it and then it turns out it's not that way. It's because it's the same machine, once again, tried. So we don't really know, but I'm willing to bet that its capacity is finite. But like you said, you can imagine like a more complicated brain entering a simulation like this, where at once it is all of the players, but different parts of that brain might be controlling the players, and there might be some deliberate interaction being weaved out of the interaction of the players, although the original human player knows all of these moves already, but there's still something happening. There may be some source of uncertainty, like the quantum uncertainty in the game, such that it's not ultimately entirely predictable, even from the single player's point of view. But I just want to say that it's not inconceivable for us to imagine humans designing this kind of, simulation where a single player can enter as multiple characters. One question might be, how will the human player feel at that time? Like if there's simultaneously 2 or 3 people talking in the game or interacting, which one of them will you feel like? And so that's the question of like sort of consciousness, of the feeling of the self. And would it be possible for a person to split themselves up into multiple characters like this? And we already have evidence from split brain patients. These are patients whose corpus callosum connecting the left and right halves have had to be cut in order to stem the spread of epileptic seizures that they were having. And so these two parts of the brain initially used to be parts of the same consciousness. But in these split brain patients, several experiments reveal that when it comes to certain aspects of personality or consciousness, the two halves effectively act as two different independent consciousnesses. So there's reason to believe that consciousness is a property that can be split and merged. So, I mean, we don't really know, but I mean, there's the horizon of possibilities is pretty wide here when it comes to splitting up a single human into multiple characters, let's say, in a simulation. So I just wanted to kind of start with the plausibility of that scenario. And then next I want to kind of introduce the idea of the Hindu traditional idea of Maya, and you'll see what the similarities are and differences are between the idea of Maya and this idea of simulation founded or motivated by current day human technology. So we'll be able to see the similarities and differences. But before I do so, I want to relate one personal experience. When I used to be how old was I? I guess high school in India. It doesn't really matter how old I was, but I remember I used to have several experiences that were like pretty intense. I don't want to go into them like right now because not all of them are relevant to this particular topic, although they are all kind of interconnected. But one of these ideas that it's kind of vague for me to remember, like were these thoughts, were these just ideas that just kind of arose in my mind, were these visions. I don't exactly remember very well. But there seemed to be sort of maybe a voluntary component of thinking to it, but also largely an involuntary component of ideas and visions and thoughts just kind of arising in my head. And so one of these visions I used to have was about what is going to happen after I die. And I guess in my imagination, or like whatever, I mean, call it the mind's eye, whatever, the vision was that against the backdrop of just complete darkness, like outer space but with no stars, I saw myself as being a stream of light. And this stream of light is kind of rushing towards some sort of a source or an ocean. And I see other streams of light like me coming and merging, and the stream just gets bigger and bigger until it kind of converges into this spiraling center where it's just like this huge orb of light. And that's just the vision that I had. At other times, I remember thinking in my head of different people or me and another person, and all of these apparent differences in people as being sort of similar to how during Easter you take like all white eggs that all kind of look the same and you paint them different. And it felt like each life we're just that same egg, and the eggs are all completely indistinguishable from each other. In the sense, so that way I should use some other analogy than eggs. Okay, so 2 eggs you can keep in 2 boxes and 2 people can eat them, so they're not really indistinguishable. They were laid at by different chickens, or maybe the same chicken at different times. But imagine the case of 2 electrons. There is no real way in which 2 electrons can really be told apart. So in that sense, in that even more indistinguishable sense, I imagine humans as being like these eggs, and every life, I had this idea of every life like as if there are multiple lives. I don't really know, but I feel like at least during a life the egg would be colored a certain color or some pattern, but then at death it would be washed off, and you know ultimately underneath we're all kind of the same. So this is related to the light stream kind of vision, in the sense that I felt like death was a sort of involuntary merging with the one thing that we all already are, and only temporarily detached from that oneness during life. That vision, when I did have it, was not necessarily a positive thing. I remember it kind of brought with it like anxieties related to death, etc. It wasn't like there was a feeling of relief associated with the thought that I would be merging myself with like a big. It felt like I didn't want to merge. I wanted to retain my individuality, and but yeah, I mean, I used to be pretty anxious about death when I was younger. Okay, so so this is just to motivate the fact that I used to have these ideas of my own. Also, the one thing that I should mention is that there was very little context from other people for me to be having these visions based on what other people said. I grew up in a fairly non-religious family. Everyone in my generation is atheist. There were rarely any even half religious ceremonies or talk or sentiments in our house, and definitely nothing having to do with these abstract ideas. They don't form the basis of any mainstream Indian religion, by the way, like this concept of unification after death or whatever. So there was very little context in my life from which I could have borrowed these. So even now, today, I'm not really, I mean, very honestly, I'm not sure where those ideas came from. And I felt like they weren't just like imaginations that I sat down and kind of made up. I felt there was this quality of being visited by these ideas. And I know that with all of my scientific training and whatever, I mean, I don't have the tools at hand to explain this. The best explanation, but not a very good one, that would have to come up is, oh, these were just like whatever figments of weird imagination in your head and they have nothing to do with anything. But I find that too much of a coincidence. Especially because when I kind of started thinking about the idea of this simulation and non-duality, and I started talking to people and experiencing other people's ideas and finding, ancient traditions in India that all kind of point towards the same story, which I had already experienced in some way, like the description of what are different selves and what happens after we die, etc. They're all kind of the same as what I'm starting to find out. So I find it too much of a coincidence. Anyway, I'll talk a little bit about it later. I'm like, well, why did I have this visions or whatever? But anyway, so back then this idea was not a welcome one for me. But since I started looking more recently into these ideas, I find sort of a reflection of the same ideas in many places. And it's not like everyone who's writing or talking about it is depressed. Most of them seem to be pretty fucking happy about this interpretation of reality. Okay, so personal story over. Now let me just tell you a little bit about the idea of Maya. Okay, so Maya, I think, so I haven't read very carefully about this, but pretty much every random Indian person that you ask on the street, can you tell me about Maya? Once they get over the awkwardness of what's happening, they most of them would be able to give you an answer. It's a very pervasive idea, regardless of how religious you are. Maya can be explained in multiple levels. I guess the most blunt description of it is Maya means that everything is an illusion. the context in which people usually use it is like, oh, this guy, you're being so attached to your money and income and your next promotion. Remember, everything is mine. It's kind of meant as like a half joke, like it's all an illusion. But the core idea or set of ideas, I guess, is that okay, so I have a few quotes here that I stole from the Wikipedia page for Maya. So in Vedic texts, so the Vedas are like a set of very old Indian sort of religious / philosophical books, not pertaining to any particular god, but it's about like a way of life, a description of reality, stuff like that. But also some like religion, metaphysics. So the Vedas and the Upanishads are kind of like two main sources of like old Indian wisdom, and the idea of Maya pops up in both of them. So in Vedic texts, Maya is can be translated to be a magic show, an illusion where things appear to be present but are not what they seem. So there's a slight difference between the usage of the English word illusion and what Maya means. It does kind of mean that it's illusory, but it doesn't mean that it's not really happening. I mean, it is happening and it is real, but it is not what it seems to be. In the sense that if you immerse someone in a hyper-real simulation where they're really feeling pain, whatever, they can still say, okay, this is real. It all feels as real as reality can possibly feel, but I'm being duped into thinking that this is not a simulation. This is not a transient video game that I'm playing for just 5 minutes. So in that sense, it's real, but it is not what it seems. It's one kind of reality having transmuted itself into a different kind of reality, so that the raw experience may be real, but your inferences about what this represents can be false. So the idea of Maya doesn't necessarily mean that every day the experiences that you're going through are unreal. It just means that the way that you interpret them are not how they are. So it kind of, I think one of the ideas is kind of like a magic show. Like everything is a magic show. Nothing is as real as you think. Okay, so a couple more sort of representative quotes. Because I myself don't know much about the idea of Maya, I just took the quotes that kind of seem to encapsulate. Okay, Maya is born, changes, evolves, dies with time from circumstances due to invisible principles of nature, state the Upanishads, which is the other set of books. Okay, and now we'll come to something that we haven't really talked about so much, a little bit. Atman Brahman is eternal, unchanging, invisible principle, unaffected, absolute, and resplendent consciousness. We'll talk a little bit about Brahman later, but in brief, it's this one creator of the simulation who is simultaneously present as all of the players, but not simply is he the creator and the player, he's also the simulation itself. So there is no separation between the simulation and the person playing. So that thing that's everything is called Brahman. Brahman in Sanskrit and Hindi has multiple translations. Brahmand means the universe or the egg of Brahman. Brahman generally means, I think it's a purely spiritual idea. So for a society that has moved away from those ideas, there is no modern day analog of what Brahman is supposed to mean, but it's supposed to mean the one or the one true or the one thing that's the universe, which in many Western cultures doesn't even make any sense. So, but I just kind of translated that. Okay, so the next quote is, then it is all mere Maya with which the Brahman deceives himself, or the Supreme Soul deceives himself. Okay, so a couple more, and this is where we'll come to, we were talking about science a little bit in the first part. Okay, so this quote goes, Maya declares Sarvasara, I guess this is some like wise person in the story in the Upanishads. Maya is anything that can be studied and subjected to proof and disproof. Anything with gunas. Gunas means qualities or aspects or properties that science usually kind of describes. In the human search for self-knowledge, Maya is that which obscures, confuses, and distracts an individual from the path of seeking self-knowledge. Okay, so a couple more quotes about, okay. So this one goes, complexes have no inner might, are empty in themselves, like an illusion which deludes the mind, like an empty fist with which a child is teased. So these are all descriptions of Maya. They are, I guess when it says complex phenomena, it doesn't mean complicated. It just means that it's not fundamental of its own. In the same way that if you have a flock of birds swarming, the motion of the swarm is a complex phenomenon, but ultimately it is revealed to be nothing more than each individual bird. Over here, they're talking about a complex phenomenon that it is ultimately empty. So a complex phenomena, they say have no inner might, are empty in themselves, like an illusion which deludes the mind. And I like it how they say like an empty fist with which a child is teased. And the reason I like it is that as humans, I have started to feel like we do spend a big chunk of our lives just being teased and chasing down this Maya. Complexes of various different complexity that are ultimately empty of themselves. You can start with, for example, the social structure of, okay, I need to make more money, I need to get a career, blah, blah. It's the whole might and necessity and importance of that attitude lies on copies of that attitude in other people's minds. So this is some sort of a complex that's very believable. It makes the world go around, very formidable. But if you look at it closely, it's empty. There is no, in the sense that the US issues dollar bills against gold, but gold itself has no value except that which is shared by other people. So this whole huge economic system, which rests on the dollar, rests on something that's gold, and it ultimately rests on empty beliefs. So that's kind of one example. But it is a very, it still does not fail to be this empty fist that keeps teasing children everywhere.
All right, so concepts that we just introduced are Maya, and then also like the one consciousness,
Brahma.
Yeah. And so these are sort of like not opposing ideas, but very distinct.
Yeah, they're very distinct in that there is a relationship between Maya and Brahma. The idea, I think, is that Brahma is the one who has created Maya, and okay, so by the way, when I say the idea is, it doesn't mean that there is one the book and then there is one the idea and every other idea is false and there's one true. So if you read the Indian Hindu texts, it's often a lot of like collaboration between people, all of whom thought a little differently from each other. So we have many different books, and then there are many different religions that came out of Hinduism. Even within Hinduism, different people have different viewpoints. So mine is just going to be my summation or accumulation of the ideas that I've got so far. So the idea is that Brahma has created Maya, and but Brahma has entered his own Maya. There was no one else other than Brahma. Brahma himself or herself, whatever. That Brahma, it doesn't make any difference. Brahma doesn't have a dick or a pussy. Okay. Now that can be on my podcast now because I said it. And Brahma has entered his own Maya and taken on the form of different people. This is where the idea of avatars come in the Indian philosophy. Avatar is a temporary form of something that's ultimately not this. So the Brahma has taken on different forms. You can imagine them as like being crystallized bits of consciousness in different people's bodies or whatever. And they're all interacting amongst themselves, and they're immersed in the circus of samsara, which is everything that's happening, particularly the human society. and all of this is like a circus. And when people die or whatever, they'll ultimately return to the soul of the Brahma. And all of this is for nothing. There is no purpose. The idea of purpose only exists within this game, but not really outside. This is not like, it's not like you're consuming resources wastefully as Brahma. I mean, Brahma is consuming resources wastefully as he is creating the simulation. It might be that in his world there is no resources, there is no waste, there is no purpose, and everything is for nothing. So that's the idea. So Brahma has created Maya. The Maya is ultimately Brahman, but not exactly the same. There is kind of this purposeless game in which the different crystallized consciousnesses have to seek self-knowledge in order to find out their true nature. And it kind of spoils the plot a little bit, because later on I was going to talk about, okay, what is the purpose of this game or whatever. But what a lot of people seem to point towards is the purpose of the game is to rise above the game, is to understand the nature of the game, and to understand the nature of yourself, and to understand the nature of the relationship between you and the game. And in that way, you kind of wake up as the Brahma. So it's sort of like a voluntary self-deception. It's like the player who deliberately suspends their identity and memory for a little bit in order to go into a game.
But then a game where the ultimate objective is to remember who you were prior to suspending?
Yeah, it's almost inevitable that you will remember. So the objective is not something that's disconnected from waking up from the game. The ultimate objective is to wake up, but the path to it is very tortuous, and has been deliberately laid by the Brahma to be non-trivial. So you'll always be faced with moral and ethical questions. You'll always be tempted by all sorts of things like, I don't know, drugs, alcohol, women, and in order to constantly distract you from the purpose. And like the different players don't really mean anything. It's not like, oh, how is Benam going to do in the game? Because, as will come later, maybe there's no free will. This is all, just for entertainment anyways. Like Benam doesn't mean anything. It's just one crystallization. If his brain were to be fused with mine, who would remain? Whose score would we keep track of? Yeah. Okay, so... But yeah, it is kind of interesting how they say that Maya is that which can be studied and subjected to proof and disproof, something that has qualities. So then the Brahma cannot be studied, is not subjected to proof and disproof, and it does not have any qualities. It's kind of interesting that these are also all different properties of what we call consciousness. It's very hard to study it. It has really not lent itself to proof or disproof, and it itself doesn't have any qualities, because it's sort of the vessel for the representation of all other objects of consciousness that have qualities.
So in this regards consciousness in your mind, I've heard like pure awareness described that way.
Yeah.
So would you say those two
Yeah,
things?
I'm kind of that's what I mean.
Okay.
Pure awareness. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so
that was from the Upanishads?
I don't know, but these were just like quotes that I stole from the Wikipedia page. I kind of cherry picked the sentences that kind of resonated with me. But this one that I just said, the studied and subjected to proof and disproof, this is from, I think, either the Veda or the Upanishad. This is something that's being said by some wise person in a story in the Upanishad. Buddhists also describe the soul or awareness as being this clear mirror on which everything else is reflected, but the mirror has really no properties of its own other than the property of being able to represent or reflect other things. And that is its only property, if you can call it a property. It's sort of, rather than being a property, it's the birth of properties of other things, if you can call that a property in itself. Well, maybe. I don't know. So I really like this quote. The whole quote is kind of to do with the purpose of people in Buddhism. I particularly like the first part of the quote. So it goes like this: understanding that what we experience is less substantial than we believe is intended to serve the purpose of liberation from ignorance, fear, and clinging, and the attainment of enlightenment as a Buddha completely dedicated to the welfare of all beings. This is more like a Buddhist angle to it. I think the more Hindu angle is less sentimental to the fate of humans. Maybe. I mean, the idea of Brahma, in and of itself, I think is supposed to be a very cold clinical idea. That is simply that which we are. In Buddhism, I think there is slightly more emphasis on the welfare of all beings, and we'll see how all of these ideas kind of come together. What does the Brahman have anything to do with welfare of all beings or whatever? We'll come to it later. But the first part of the quote, which has really nothing to do with Buddhism, I really like, and it goes, understanding that what we experience is less substantial than we believe. And this is what we had spent almost all the time of the first part of our conversation on. And the reason we had to spend so much time dissecting and repeating and remembering that our experience is less substantial than our beliefs. The reason we had to do it is that it's kind of, I feel like it's embedded so deeply in our psyche that it takes repetition, it takes reflection, it takes time to slowly realize that that really is true, that our beliefs in their solidity and their certainty have far exceeded our raw experience. And that means something. If we keep living in a world of thoughts and ideas, it doesn't, but the real world is not the world of thoughts and ideas. There's always a layer of thoughts and ideas, and we're perceiving everything through that lens. And as long as we keep perceiving things through that lens of thoughts and ideas, it's fine for us to go around having such solid certainty on our beliefs as opposed to raw experience. But once you start putting raw experience in front, then it really starts making a difference. You start noticing that when you put less certainty or substance in your beliefs, your interaction with the world really does start to change.
In what way?
So, I can only describe it from my personal experience. Some superficial ways in which I've started to release my hold on ideas is, who am I supposed to be in life? What am I supposed to do? What is my career supposed to be like? My identity and my career trajectory and my future used to be more rigid things that I felt like my experience had to align itself to. So I was putting that as the priority for what I ought to do in the immediate future. It was being dictated by this nebulous idea. And now I realized that it was all a fiction that I was constantly feeding into by the facts of my life, and that I am ultimately free to do what I want. And the more I subscribe to the idea that I'm free, the more I will end up doing things that will keep eroding the solidity of that idea. And so the solidity of the idea did not derive itself from anything fundamental other than how solid it was in my brain. So that's kind of one way. The other thing is my own thoughts. Since I started meditating, I've noticed they simply arise and pass away. They're transient. My mental states are very transient. So actions that I would normally have taken years back in an angry or anxious or sad frame of mind, I don't always end up taking, because just the simple act of waiting changes the whole climate inside my head and my intentions change. So that's another way in which kind of releasing my hold on the solidity or certainty of my thoughts and ideas has kind of been like a self-fulfilling prophecy, really. So there, that. And in some other ways, I feel like the notion of the ego or the self, that in me has definitely eroded a lot. That's another like idea construct. Who am I? And I used to be pretty obsessed with this idea of non-duality. Like, how do you dissolve the boundary between the self and the other? But in many ways, in multiple different experiences or multiple different times, I have noticed that this boundary has dissolved. I don't make as much of it anymore as I used to. So I was just saying how. What you asked me how starting to realize that our beliefs are more substantial than our experience has made a difference. So that has made a difference. The other thing that I do want to talk about a little bit, although this might sound a little weird, is that we kind of believe in the existence of objects in the external world. Like, here's this table, there's this a computer, here's my body, here's a microphone, and the rigidity or solidity of the idea of external objects has also kind of started to kind of fray at the corners a little bit. For example, I started kind of asking myself, on what basis do we what is the concept of physical objects based on? The overwhelming experience is visual. So you look around and you see the table, but the visual experience itself is constantly blending. Like, as you move your eyes, the pixel that represented the carpet becomes the pixel that represents the table. So that the raw experience itself it's always transient. Like, pixels that belong to one object is constantly becoming another object. Sensations or experience are constantly blending together. So the idea of solid objects that kind of hold their own and only project themselves through transient and mixing phenomena is, after all, an inferred idea. So if you start to notice that, then in many other ways, so for example, the molecules that constitute this table is forever not going to remain that table. In the historical past and in the future, they will constitute other objects. The cells in my body have not always been my own.
I'm curious. I feel like we, as humans, maybe have a knack for projecting that notion of solidity.
Yeah.
But that it's not trained when we're born. I don't know how much of like your early childhood you remember, but like some things that I tried really hard to hold on to at various points was just like the feeling of total and utter confusion about how what it was that I was experiencing seemed to not be what other people were experiencing. Whether it was like, just the idea that like there's this thinginess about this thing that is fundamental as opposed to just a projection.
Yeah.
Right? Like which to me there was this like it was just this chronic fatigue of being overwhelmed by like a litany of the categories of these various things that to me were much more nebulous in their definition. And constantly it seemed to be as if everyone was always operating with answers about exactly which category to put things in, when I'm like, well, we could do this one of like millions of ways, right? We could do it as like its approximation of cylindricalness, like, and that's how we first see the world, or right? Like it's just like just a host of arbitrary things that you can argue or have there's a score dictated by pragmatism. Like, you don't give things just like the stupidest definitions.
We call it a chair because it like
we intend to imply.
When we say a chair, we mean the special subclass of objects that serves an intended purpose.
Right, that you can sit on.
Philosophers have spent so much time with questions like these, like, why do you call that thing a chair? Would you call this a chair? Would you call would you call this a brick? What do you mean by the inside of a brick when no one has seen the inside? The moment you make it see the inside, it is the outside. Blah 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 blah. But yeah, so I think it's partly trained by language and culture, the naming and categorization, but part of it is more ingrained. So when you're a baby, way before you have started talking, if I give you a toy, you will kind of
heft it.
Yeah, you will like play with it a little bit until. So basically, what you're doing then is that you're forming. So there's the visual representation of the object, and no one needs to be trained to see the object. That's very automatic. You give a baby what do you call it? What are those things that you shake?
Shaker.
A shaker, and you immediately see the baby immediately sees the shaker. There needs to be no level of training, cultural or otherwise, in order for the baby to see the shaker. So, but the shaker is recognized to be some sort of an object. Because the object recognition capacity is within the visual stream itself. But I think to some extent it works with. So I'm coming to that. So the baby also picks up the shaker and kind of plays with it and has tactile input and sensations of this object. But in the early days, when the baby is playing with it and getting simultaneously the tactile sensation as well as the visual sensation, their brain is learning something. Their brain is learning to map those two sets of sensations from the two sensory streams together, and it can do it much better if it maps it to the same abstract idea in its head, whose different properties now link to the different sensory stimuli. So this is done without the help of language or coaxing or people telling you. This is just the brain putting different sensory stimuli together. A large part of what babies do in their pre-language years is train these kinds of things. Learn implicitly about how heavy things are, what happens when you throw stuff in the world. If you see something in front of you, how should you engage your muscles to reach out and grasp? And all of these, I think, in some higher abstract center of the brain necessitates the formation of ever more sophisticated and complex models of objects outside in the world. But you can imagine that if the experience of this baby were to be very different, if their experience were to be a lot more fluid and things were not really keeping their object-like shape and were not consistent in their inputs to you across the different sensory modalities, that the baby's ideas of objects and whatever might be very different. And then later on, then there's this whole thing where people keep refining your idea of objects. Like, this is a car. No, this is a different car than that. Oh no, baby, yesterday you said that's a horse, it's a doggy, blah blah blah, and you just keep. A lot of these things you wouldn't even actually learn by yourself unless you were told by other people. For example, Eskimos have 11 words for white, for different shades of white. Not only would we not know the names of these different colors of white, if they pointed them out to us, a lot of us would shrug and say they're the same color. And this has to do with the fact that our real raw resolution of sensation is modified by our mental maps of them. So if in a language there aren't words for certain sensations, chances are that people will not be able to discriminate among those different variants.
Well, and it's not necessarily because without the words we have no abilities, but without the words there's no there are few opportunities to practice discriminating.
Yeah. And so the brain just allocates fewer resources to discriminating them because it has not been important. Slightly racist example. When I first came here was the first time that I saw so many Asian faces. For some reason, American faces are okay for us to distinguish. Maybe, well, let's not get into that. Partly it has to do with media. But I hadn't seen so many Asian faces. And I remember, very honestly, telling myself, I'm not a racist person. I just find them very hard to tell apart. But this phenomenon didn't keep existing. Like, after a couple years or so, I could first very easily tell apart my friends from other Asians that kind of look like them, and then eventually I could start telling Asian faces apart. So why does that happen? It's not like the brain is racist and like, oh, they're all the same. It's because the brain doesn't bother allocating face detection and identification resources, which are actually very large resources, to a data set of faces that it has never been seen before.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, anyway, so object recognition and categorization are kind of like super complex ideas, and they're trained and developed at various different stages of development and learning. But yeah, I was kind of talking about how my grip on the solidity of even external objects has started to sort of release in ways that I mean, it's hard for me to kind of explain, because it feels like two different alternate interpretations of the same sensory stimulus. Mm-hmm. So it just feels like a play of semantics. But to me, in some ways, in some experiences, it doesn't feel like semantics. For example, if I'm letting an anxious thought go, the intellectual understanding of how solid the anxious thought is makes a difference in your ultimate experiential whatever. Okay, so yeah, okay, so so the Buddhists believe that this is intended to serve as the purpose of liberation. You can see some connections. Purpose of liberation from ignorance, fear, clinging, and the attainment of enlightenment as a Buddha completely dedicated to the welfare of all beings. So we'll talk a little bit about the welfare of all beings. Okay, so one bullet point I had here was the connection with non-duality. And the non-duality, I think I will do a podcast on non-duality separately. So this is an idea that has that arose in multiple different contexts, in different countries, in different traditions, different cultures. But one of the older versions of those, the idea was once again from India, from a book called the Advaita Vedanta. I don't think it's a whole book. It's just a couple of paragraphs at the end of one of the Vedas. And Advaita means not two. And the central statement of the thesis is that one of the ways of saying it is that the Atma and the Brahman are not two, meaning your soul and the Supreme Soul are not two. It's the same. But there is also another way of saying it, which is that you and your experience are not different, are not two, they are the same. So, in other words, the different players of the simulation are not separate from the creator, but also the players are not separate from the game. And teachers of non-duality will often give talks about the illusory separation between the experiencer and the experience. And most scientifically minded people have a very well-defined mental division between themselves and their experiences. But for example, through some meditation techniques of looking closely at the contents of your consciousness, it can be shown that this boundary between self and outside self is illusory. For example, if you sit and close your eyes and you imagine the tingling sensation at the tip of your finger, it's going to be kind of hard for me to explain here, but the tingling is because your finger is touching the air. But if all you can feel is the tingling itself, then where does that tingling, where does the air end and your skin begin? It's just tingling. And so if you really pay attention to simply the raw experience, you'll see that nothing in the raw experience tells you clearly that this is the boundary. This is the boundary. Boundaries are always inferred. And any sensation that you experience happens, if I might put it this way, at the boundary. Always. At the boundary between self and interaction with the world. Sometimes the world can be parts of your own body as well. So for example, if you want to say, okay, I want to touch my hand to my thigh, then you kind of arbitrarily divide up the boundary as being between your hand and your thigh, and your hand is experiencing your thigh. Your mind kind of experiences your thigh touching your hand and your hand touching the thigh at the same time. It's just this weird, but we still have this weird boundary, Or for example, if I touch my hand on the top of this sofa cushion. I don't experience anything that the sofa cushion experiences. I only experience my hand experiencing the sofa cushion. But if you look closely, these are all inferred thoughts. The only thing that I experience is a sensation of touch. And any other idea that is brought in that, oh, the touch happens inside the hand is inside me, the sofa is outside me, is based on those abstract notions of object and object division between my body and categorization that has to do with sort of cross-validating the tactile sensory information with other kinds of information. Like visually, I see my hand going up and touching the sofa, and the rest of the day the sofa remains very far from my consciousness and I don't get to feel anything, so it can't be part of my body, etc. But the idea of objects and boundaries between them, we don't really notice exists in the world of thoughts and concepts, not in the world of raw sensation. In the world of raw sensation, there is only raw sensation. What you decide to label it as or categorize it under is kind of subjective, really. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the connection of the simulation theory with non-duality. So
with non-duality?
With non-duality. So I told you what the idea of non-duality was, that there is no difference, there not two. And I already kind of drew the connections, right, because I was talking about today we're talking about the nature of the simulation, and I kind of said a few things that are pointing to how the different players are only apparently different, but ultimately all the same, and the game is the same as the player. So these are ideas that are shared with non-duality, although they might use different language to explain. So the simulation theory, or the theory of Maya, or this whole idea, kind of subsumes, among other ideas, the idea of non-duality. And non-duality was an idea that I was kind of exclusively obsessed with ever since I read about it in Waking Up by Sam Harris. So now I kind of feel like I can understand non-duality as part. I used to think of non-duality as the ultimate end all and be all, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow of spiritual and philosophical and scientific understanding. But now I see it as part of a bigger picture, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so now here I want to talk a little bit about free will. If all of the players are ultimately the same, and if the player is the same as the world, in the sense that what appears to be the world, or what appears to be the player, or what appears to be consciousness or experience, are all simultaneously one and the same thing being created out of this, out of nothingness at the same time, so that the game and the player are simultaneously imagining each other into being. It's all one cocktail, really. If that is true, if the player and game do not have separate origins and are only coming in contact, then the idea of, or the notion of the sensation of free will of a player going through this game would have to be an illusion. Mm-hmm. If something like the Brahma created the game out of a part of his own consciousness and entered it as an apparently separate being, then it would mean that there is no real external secondary source of free will. Free will is kind of like, what is free will? Free will requires two entities, let's call them player and game, where one does not anticipate the other. In this case, the game does not anticipate the other. Or let's say the rules of the game do not predicate what the player would do. Mm-hmm. So the idea of determinism, for example, is that the rules of the game of this universe are such that they also determine what we are about to do. So no surprises anywhere. Okay. Free will is that no, there will be surprises. So there's a lack of information of one party about the other. Mm-hmm. The way that it feels when you walk into a room and say hi to a person, you don't know what the person is going to do, because you don't know that person, because there are limits of information. But if the same entity is both the player and the game, then there can be no honest free will. There can be the illusion of free will, maybe, in the same way that there are illusions of everything else. In our talk so far, we have seen how, there are so many things that, are appearing to be what they're not. Like, for example, the idea of objects, etc. We may not want to call them illusions, but they're like derived concepts. If we look, and they're not backed up by the reality of raw sensation. Once again, when it comes to free will, maybe if we look really closely at our raw sensation, we'll start finding things out like, hey, I wasn't the author of that thought. It just came into my head. And what it did was, I had this thought, it gave rise to another thought, and ultimately to a demand, and I moved my hand to buy that cup of ice cream. And what I'm mistakenly doing is looking at this whole chain of when this first thought appeared to my final purchase as being evidence of free will. Going from the first thought to the action. But that is not free will. Free will is saying I came up with the first thought, in that I had some hand in not having come up with that. So there could be an illusion of free will, or we could be saying free will about something that it actually is not. And in fact, I think in around 1962, a psychologist or neuroscientist called Benjamin Libet, neuroscientist, conducted an experiment which is kind of like now widely cited, both inside and outside science, as having exhibited evidence against free will. So there was this person who was hooked up to a machine that was looking at blood flow, or the rate of blood flow in the brain, and I guess they had to make a decision at some point of whether or not to push a switch. And the experimenters were looking at their blood flow, and using the blood flow, they could predict what the subject would do before the subject themselves knew that they were about to do it. So ever since then, the whole field of the question of free will has kind of become an exciting one. Other people, I guess, have done experiments.
And so the idea in that experiment is that if there is there's evidence of some sort of predictive force that exists temporally prior to the person being aware or thinking that they're thinking of making a decision, then that would be evidence against the idea that they were even making a decision when they thought they were thinking they were making a decision.
If imagine the first moment at which you become aware that you want to press the button.
Mm-hmm.
If your button pressing had been decided prior to that moment, then no matter who is in the driver's seat, you are not.
Mm-hmm.
You are downstream of when the decision was already made.
Okay, that's interesting. So it could be that there is free will, but we
it wouldn't be our will.
Right, or at least it wouldn't be something that we experience in real time. You could say maybe it's like we are capable only of remembering our decision making, but we aren't necessarily.
But that is completely at odds with the general notion of free will that has existed in theology, or in just the general understanding of people. That sort of free will is going to be like a useless free will to most people. Like, oh, there is some sort of free will. It takes place in my stomach without my permission, and then I'm just told about it a couple seconds down the line. Then if you keep using the word free will for it, then it's kind of dishonest. There's nothing free about that.
Okay, well, but let's say the mechanisms of free will are there are these notions of choice and deliberation and that your thoughts go through a certain process, and so say the process itself that dictates those thoughts occurs before, but nonetheless are reflected with fidelity in the process itself. So it's like if I see the shadow of free will, if my awareness is the shadow of free will, even though I'm never the free will itself, if I'm a faithful rendering of it, does that make it any less real?
No, it may not be less real, but I think the only reason that people care about free will so much, and there's so much talk about it in religious texts, is people want to feel like they're in control of their lives to some extent. And that is the relevance of free will. In some technical way, you could still say, okay, this is a decision still arising within the mind-body mechanism, and there is some degree of non-determinism in that, or whatever. You might find some sort of whole. But the very fact that our awareness is downstream of the decision-making process makes most of the interesting features or desirable features of that free will. Just it's not really free. It's not free in the sense that you're not free to choose.
Mm-hmm. Is this notion of downstream free will, is it airtight against like notions of recursion? So like say like now that I see in like is it always just like a feed that I only get to observe come out at a discrete time, whatever slice of awareness I have, that can I never, like, just by merit of being aware of the thoughts that I've already decided prior to being aware of them, can I not then alter the flow of thoughts downstream?
That's kind of speculative. Maybe, I don't know. You might decide to do that, but it would have been decided already.
Right. That's what I'm saying. It's like is it?
So
does it? Yeah.
Yeah. So you might do whatever you want. Like you could suddenly decide, okay, now I'm gonna do this, and it's gonna stop. But that decision was made for you.
Mm-hmm. So it's like you're just observing yourself get trapped in a determined like frenzy of self-referential mania.
I guess.
I don't know.
Okay, so anyway, I kind of wanted to talk about how the idea, I guess, that neuroscientists are starting to find out that free will is an illusion would make sense in the simulation hypothesis if the nature of the simulation is such that there is no real difference. It's all really the same system, just different parts interacting amongst themselves. And since there is no source of information or knowledge or design or intelligence other than the Brahman, everything is already known and everything is already designed, and there is nothing that is unknown, there is nothing that is unanticipated, nothing that is unpredicted, because everything is the same. But there could be the illusion of limits to knowledge. For example, it seems to us very clearly that we don't know everything about the universe. We conjecture that there's so much of the universe outside of what we are experiencing as our raw sensations every moment, and all of those parts of the universe are unknown to us. All of these galaxies, whatever. But once again, if you notice, those are all inferences. The only thing that's real is our raw experience, and everything that we say we don't know anything about are just thoughts inside our head. So there's the idea of the limit of information or the limit of knowledge. I could say I don't know anything about what's going on inside your mind, but maybe nothing is going on. I didn't mean to take a jab. It just came out that way. I'm sorry, but you are a rubber duck. I'm sorry.
No, I'm not offended.
Yeah, okay.
I was I wasn't really thinking anything, was I?
But it looks like other players in this game have free will. They do these things that we don't anticipate, and they act in ways that we find our own selves acting. So probably.
But here's something interesting, right? It's like you can see, like, as you reduce sort of like the cognitive complexity of various species, they become, to us, apparently more and more predictable.
Yeah.
Right. Like as if they're available behaviors are just it's a smaller and smaller set, right?
Yeah.
To the point where after a while we're like, that's not intelligent. So I think it's so to me it's kind of interesting that we see this gradient readily apparent across species, and it seems as if you're hypothesizing that there isn't a significant gradient amongst human individuals, right? Like say we are all like of the same essence and have just been given different.
Well, I'm not making such a strong distinction between humans and other animals in this argument. I'm just saying that humans
as with other animals, we feel like they have free will. Like if you have a dog, it does seem like they have a certain reduced capacity of free will. Doesn't it seem that way? I mean, it does seem like sometimes the dog just kind of decided to just lie down right there on the carpet instead of like walking a couple more feet, although sometimes it does the other thing. But if you notice a dog, you will realize that you ascribe less free will to a dog than you do to a human. And it could simply be the limits of our predictability of other animate creatures. For humans, it's harder for us to predict what they will be doing. And so I think to some extent, we conflate our limits of the prediction of a system as ascribing some sort of intelligence or complexity or free will to that system.
Well, and also I think you need some notion of free will to convince people to enforce measures of accountability. Like for humans, we care about the free will because when people do things we don't want them to do, we have to be able to hold them responsible in a way that we don't really care about doing for dogs. You know,
that's true. Actually, Sam Harris made an interesting comment. He was talking about free will and ethics at some conference, and he said that most of our legal system here in America, like with many other countries, is kind of predicated on the assumption of free will, and it goes by the legal system mostly operates through penalty and through punishment. Okay, I'm going to teach you a lesson because you obviously decided to make that choice, and that was wrong of you, and therefore we should punish you. And you're saying that doesn't really measure up to what scientists are finding out. They're finding out that there is no free will. Of course, that doesn't mean that from now on you'll just let all criminals go scot-free. Just imagine that after the end of this talk, you guys are in the parking lot in the back and suddenly someone shouts, "Oh, there's a bear." You will take preventative action against the bear potentially killing someone, and you don't have to worry about whether or not the bear has any free will in order to mitigate any damage that the bear might bring. And this is my addition, and I'm pretty sure that when the bear is, let's say, trying to attack you, any actions that you might take to mitigate the effects of that, not only does it, I mean, in the moment, whatever you'll be doing, you won't sit down and first decide whether or not the bear has free will. Also, you will not sit down and decide whether or not you have free will before deciding to. Things just happen. Whether or not there is free will, we are always kind of submerged helplessly in this current of life where your body does things that it does. And maybe someday we will have figured out that there was no free will in it ever. It doesn't mean that things never happened, or good things never happened, or bad things never happened. So that was about free will. But I guess within the simulation or Maya theories, the idea of free will would also be a Maya. It's not what it seems to be. It's not real. However, the illusion does make the game a lot more engaging. If you were submerged in a game where you knew that you were not really controlling the player, things were just happening, it would be like a movie. But the whole point of a game is to have some notion of free will, or at least some illusion of it. Okay, so I wanted to talk about free will. Okay, so then sort of so then all of this apparent phenomena, this whole complicated storyline of so many different people living in a world with galaxies and whatever, and like a planet with so many different complex life forms interacting in ever more complicated ways, so many different problems that we have, the economy, the environment, we've got a clown on the throne, and all sorts of problems in our social life, cultural life, political, economic life, but also in our personal lives 24/7. We're having to battle with boredom, with moral and ethical questions. We are not happy. We are too happy. We are thin. We are fat. What do we do? I'm bored. So all of this apparent separation of different people. We see ourselves as separate from other people, separate from the game. We see all these myriad forms of actions and objects, and we have this apparent free will and purpose of life that we're constantly hunting out, even if it be spiritual purpose. So they are all ultimately empty if it is all the same underneath. And this idea is called shunyata in Buddhism. Shunya means zero, and shunyata just means emptiness. So in Buddhism, I can't really draw a bridge between what we're talking about and Buddhism, but I suspect it's probably going to turn out to be right, that the idea of shunyata in Buddhism essentially refers to the emptiness that is ultimately underneath everything. But I don't think that the takeaway from that realization is supposed to be pessimistic. It's just supposed to be neutral. It's just a realization that everything is ultimately empty. And my personal take on why you shouldn't be depressed about it is that every happy thing, every meaningful thing, every beautiful thing that has ever happened to you in life has happened through that emptiness. Mm-hmm. So what higher purpose, value, beauty did your vision suddenly slip from? If there was an idea of some higher value, beauty, profundity, knowledge, purpose, then it was fabricated by you in your mind, but you used as evidence beauty, purpose, knowledge that has managed to emerge from this emptiness, so chill. I kind of feel similarly about, Richard Dawkins wrote this book called The Selfish Gene, in which he kind of broke down, we are just these gene machines and this is how we evolved. And he got a letter from a young student saying that she took that book so seriously that she was flung into the pits of despair after she read the book. She found all her motivation for joy and beauty and happiness in life stripped away because she found no purpose in being. Life just became this gloomy thing. It was like, that's it's not like she was being irrational before to think that life was beautiful and purposeful and meaningful and worth living. I feel that she's being irrational now to decide that because I've found that it's driven by genes and selection, that all of that has now disappeared. Mm-hmm. Then the time has come for you to realize that there were some irrationalities in the construct of whatever you thought to be real beauty and real purpose.
If it were contingent upon a particular interpretation of things that just are.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, anyway, so it's called Shunyata in Buddhism. So what's the point? What's the point of all of these myriad forms? And I think there's no point, and there doesn't always have to be a point. Humans, for example, a good example, and also like young animals, when we create and engage in our own games for no purpose, we spend a lot of money. I think humans spend a lot of money to play games of many different forms. We willfully enter it, although we know that it's empty, and also with money, career, life, even when we're not playing so-called easily noticeable games, we're still always playing this ultimately empty game. And should we ever forget that this is ultimately empty, I think death is the final reminder. No matter where you get in life, how much money and power you have, how real you think your advances are, how real you think the score on the corner of the screen is, ultimately it's going to be reset to zero. I think. So in that sense, I feel like death actually serves a very important purpose in this game, is to be the final resort of the end point of the game, and therefore that which keeps the game a game. If human beings can ever find out the key to never dying, then every stake will become infinite times. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine, like, everything will become so much more valuable, not necessarily in a positive sense.
Well, it changes. It changes.
Everything will become so solid.
Well, it skews it entirely changes your assessment of risk, right? It
Yeah,
changes
yeah.
what used to always be a question of when, right?
Yeah.
Like you have a finite number of years, so
Yeah.
do you die jumping out of an airplane or sitting on a couch, right?
Yeah.
Like it's a when question, but then
Yeah.
why would you get in a fucking airplane if it's an if question? You
Yeah.
know, it's like
Yeah,
whoa, what, like you're
yeah.
yeah, no, I totally get that. I think, I mean, there's every reason for that to be a disaster, to like, regardless of its deeper implications, just like the way it would skew human behavior
Yeah.
for certain people to have access to
Yeah.
potential, like, a mortal lifestyle that would be.
Yeah. So with this idea, we've been talking about death, just as with other objects and concepts that we discussed before. Now, under this new model or understanding or interpretation, death kind of loses its solidity as well. Death is only the end of this particular form of the game. It is the cessation of this particular character doing whatever it is doing in this particular body. And it is sort of a return to that indivisible soul, or the knowing, or the awakening. And so ultimately, it is not to be feared. And whatever does fear death is the transient, illusory, temporary form or self that has crystallized for a limited period of time. Mm-hmm. And so if you observe your fear, that will point you to that which is not ultimately endless, that which is not ultimately permanent, that which is not ultimately true or intransient. So if you keep kind of tracing back the source of your fear, you will find the transient self. So when I was telling you that I used to have these visions, they used to always be kind of coupled with a gripping, paralyzing fear of death. And something in my head, there was this voice saying, keep following it, keep like, just jump headlong into this fear. And I always held back. And so that was kind of like a very depressive period of my life, actually. And sometimes I wonder, especially these days, I wonder what would have happened if I had jumped headlong. There are accounts of other people, like, for example, Eckhart Tolle. He had sort of a very negative experience when he was in undergrad, and he was gripped by a fear of like failure and ending or death. And there was a voice that just came into his head, this is according to his own accounts, that said, resist nothing. And so he didn't resist this thing that was sucking him in, and he completely survived. And so other people have described this as well as surviving your own death. For example, Tagore, whose writings I was reading, he has talked about this multiple times. He has said things like, if you can die before you die, that is the ultimate living. Which is sort of a suspension of all that is the limited idea of the limited self that I am. If you can kill it, then what you get as reward is life. And maybe physically, the same is true when we will physically die. That all of this fear that's associated with ending may turn out to be just a real unification with what life is and what we are. Anyway, so just ideas. Okay, so so death is the final reminder that it's all ultimately empty. Now we want to talk a little bit about what is the objective of this game while we are actually playing it. We kind of hinted at one objective before, which is self-knowledge, and self-knowledge is also knowledge of the world, the knowledge that there is no separation, that we are this creator, etc. At this point, we are sitting here talking about it intellectually using words. This is not the same as that self-knowledge. It can help and it can work together with knowledge at a deeper level. But I've kind of noticed that sitting and talking about it and reading about it, an intellectual understanding of what we are is not the same thing as really knowing what we are. But the intellect has its own uses. I think it can lead you to the right people and the right ideas, but then it is still up to a different part of you to imbibe that in other ways. And not all of the other ways are intellectual. Only one part is intellectual. So one universal objective that I find very few people kind of disagreeing with among the ones that I've read or the ideas that I've read seems to be the desire to dissolve the separate identity. That's like one objective of the game, or to recognize that there is no separate identity, and whatever we hold on to sort of it always keeps reconstituting the separate identity, and it's kind of like a feedback process, and then the separate identity wants to keep believing in things that reaffirms the notion of the separate identity. So the one universal objective seems to be the dissolution of that, and some people use drugs for it. And one of my first introductions to the dissolution of the ego was through MDMA. But that was more like an empathogenic thing. I felt like I was still a separate person. I want to talk about this in more detail in the non-duality podcast. But then I remember taking shrooms, and on shrooms, I'm sure, I don't remember, but on shrooms I wrote down that this is a non-dual experience, as in I can see that there is a character called Neil in this room, but I see that from the same point of view as I see all of the other characters. So there are many different ways in which you can approach the notion of dissolving the barrier between the self and the world. And I think somewhat deliberately it is meant to be a task that is frightening. Otherwise it would be just too easy. The rewards are really great. I can guarantee you that if you make the right incremental moves towards this, depending on where you are in your life and what kind of person you are, working with your strengths and weaknesses, every incremental progress gives you a lot of rewards. And in my case, the rewards that, well, let's talk a little bit more about this later. But in summary, I think the rewards for me have been a greatly decreased sense of baseline anxiety, much richer engagement, appreciation, and respect for life, and a sort of, I feel like in many ways life is flowing through me much more freely than it used to years back. And I realized that there used to be this fictional idea of this is not good enough, I need to find something better. And I find that now I find life to be ultimately, it's the most intense thing that you can ever experience. And so there have been changes, and you were kind of rewarded. So no one can come and tell you that this is what the objective of the game is, because I've proved it this way. Because if you take the right steps, the right rewards are very intensely subjective. So only you can experience. So, and there's no real way to prove it to someone else that I've figured out what life is. The only thing that you can then do is sort of reflect some of that back onto them so that they see for themselves that, okay, something's happened to this guy. Mm-hmm. I'm intrigued. This sounds fun. Let's do more of this, Okay. So that seems to be one universal objective. Okay, yeah. So it seems to be the desire to dissolve the separate identity and to merge. Now, like I said, I think not coincidentally, there seems to be a lot of fear associated. If you start from the very first step, okay, let's take something very simple. I'll take something from my own experience. I went to a dance club and I was kind of like a rigid, kind of stiff person. I didn't want to dance. And so there's self-consciousness involved. Nothing remotely close to death, but it still is a negative sentiment of rigidity and solidity that is associated with the notion of the self. And as you start taking small steps towards them, like, okay, let me embarrass myself a little tiny bit tonight. you'll see that the next night you're not feeling embarrassed anymore. You're feeling happy. And I'm like, whoa. So what lay on the other side of this flimsy barrier of embarrassment and self-consciousness was happiness. So you start noticing, and in ways that you can't describe or prove or argue with other people, you start taking little steps in the directions that make sense only to you. And the sense making is made through the rewards that you get, that you don't have to justify or defend in front of anyone else. So that seems to be one objective. So there's fear, and the ultimate fear is the fear of death. But if this were the only ultimate objective of the game wouldn't have been devised in the first place. Because in this game, there's there's a separation of the different players. There's a separation between the world and the self that has to be unlearned at some point. So if the merging and union was to be the ultimate objective of the creator, there wouldn't be any fabricated separation in the first place. One thing could be, and this is like highly speculative, is that this being a separate person but in the company of other people gives you a sense of what it feels like to be separate and the loneliness that's caused from being separate, and it gives you little bits and pieces of the happiness and joy that comes from union in many ways, like helping someone out, spending time with them. There can be physical union, there can be mental union of all sorts. And I think maybe in some ways it's supposed to be instructive. It's supposed to remind us, or it's supposed to tell us something. And here I remember what Pratim said. He said, oh, the one consciousness came into being all into this void, and it was just lonely, had nothing to do, and therefore it kind of divided itself up into multiple different consciousnesses that will ultimately merge again. And maybe the whole thing is an exercise in creating and repeatedly creating and dissolving separation, because the one consciousness felt lonely in the beginning. But how can there even be such a thing as a feeling of loneliness if there is just this one thing? I mean, it doesn't really make any sense. So I have no idea. But, I mean, there doesn't have to be any purpose to this repeated separation and merging. It doesn't have to be any purpose. Maybe
it could even be that, like, that is in and of itself like a fundamental attribute of the thing running the simulation, right? Right, like that's just like the way we have like 2 feet and 2 hands. It's just like it decomposes and reassembles.
It could be that. But maybe that's not even fundamental. Maybe this game is just one among many other possible games that could be played. Mm-hmm. And this just happens to be the nature of this game that we are temporarily submerged in. Okay. So somewhat connected to this, so now I've kind of given you how my ideas about reality has changed. Sort of along the lines of this, I wrote a blog post recently called The Only Reality, in which I kind of described that I am now less certain, in the same way that I've kind of relaxed my certainty about other things. I'm kind of less certain about this narrative, about this universe that has existed for billions of years, and I just came into it like 29 years ago, and I will live for a certain period of time, and the universe will keep living. So there's this objective notion of the universe, of which I'm only a tiny fraction, and there's all of this other stuff going on that doesn't give a shit about me, like just going on all on its own, and I'm just this insignificant part that will have some sort of limited influence, cause and effect influence on the universe for a limited period of time, and then it will just keep going on, like it's like some sort of train that I hopped on board for a little bit and then I hop off and the train just keeps going, but I die. This is the basic, the most widely shared notion of what life is about. And my solidity of this belief has started to kind of dissolve, if for no other reason, in favor of the idea that this is a strongly personal universe. You can call this idea the same as solipsism. It's like everything is for me, nothing exists beyond me. Doesn't mean that I'm always like the center of everything. When I say I here, I mean the sum total of my experience, which includes things that I see, other people that I interact with, or apparent other people that I interact with. So this is not an egoistic assertion that I'm like the most important thing in the universe, but the universe is identical to me and there's nothing beyond. So the history of the universe is my history, and it came into being the day that I was born. And the end of the universe is going to be my end, however it is. And the universe will cease to exist if I do happen to die. So that's one notion of what I mean when I say that that the universe, or the way that I regard the universe, has become a lot more personal. This has not been simultaneous with me becoming like more selfish. It has actually been simultaneous with me becoming more at one with the universe. Okay, but in a slightly more weird way, and this is something that I hinted at the very beginning of this conversation, and now I realize that I should have only mentioned it now. I told you how we scientists kind of look around at the world as if it's this, not really dead, but this mechanical thing that's kind of just doing its own thing, and the only source of sentience or understanding or intelligence is in people like us trying to figure out the laws that govern this machine. My feelings, I shouldn't say my thoughts, I should say my feelings of relating to the universe has changed from that vantage point. Now I feel like all of this evidence that I'm getting, that, you know, life is not easy, it's not easy to be happy, things are kind of tricky, the whole world, especially when it comes to the interaction between the mind and the world, between values and intentions, is always riddled with paradoxes. That which is most fearful can also be the most liberating. All of these sort of, to me, are now starting to appear as signatures of some sort of superior intelligence and not just happenstance. If you remember back to the human creator, scientist, or engineer trying different iterations of creating a rich world, the richness that we see in life, if you just open your eyes and pay attention and you're receptive, I don't think it is any accident. Every minute is filled with boundless intensity, richness, moral, ethical dilemmas, all sorts of questions with no answers, and it's like teeming with it if you pay attention. And if you are not paying attention, if you are bored or depressed or kind of lost, that's part of it. That's all part of what I'm talking about. And that's part of the challenge that has arisen. So, I mean, you can't use that as evidence that this is not interesting. You know, it's part of what is supposed to be interesting. Interesting doesn't mean that you lie in the corner happy and eating ice cream until you die. That's not. So the fact that I find interestingness everywhere now, only because I've started kind of opening my eyes, it feels like now I won't be as surprised if I find a superior intelligence behind what feels like teeming sentience everywhere. So when I say teeming sentience, I once again mean it has connections to how we were talking about categorizing objects. Like you touch this floor, you're like, oh, that's dead. It doesn't make any difference that it's dead. It's appearing to you as life. You touch it, you feel it. You look at it, you see it. You know, it performs a certain function. The intellectual idea that this thing is dead, most things are dead, whatever, that doesn't change anything about what I'm saying here. The sentience that I'm seeing is very immediate, very profound right here, and it is in the experience of things. And the fact that there are any things outside of my experience is like this false notion anyway, so I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about pure experience. Whether you define it as me experiencing things or the world, you know, it's all the same thing. And this same thing is just life. There can't be anything livelier than this. This is life. So, and I know that I, Neil, did not design this. So, maybe I've forgotten that I designed it and I entered. But in this limited existence, in my limited memory, in this game world, I don't remember designing this. And I think I would be less surprised if someday I realized that there was a designer, not in the same sense as a person designing a thing, but a person like making their own self appear as different, apparently designed, interesting forms, or creating a being with such hardware that, or such a perception of the universe that they would find this interesting. Like here, I create this object and I create the subject, and I decide that the subject will be such and the object will be such that the subject will find the object interesting. And all of this for no purpose, because I was bored. If they are in a position to be able to do that, why not? Yeah. So I've started seeing kind of sentience in places in a very exaggerated form. I'll give you an example of how this happened. I was on LSD, and I was kind of, everything that I'm talking about now was kind of extra amplified then when I was on LSD in Mexico City. At some point, I was kind of thinking about the sentience of everything. And at the same time, I kind of needed to charge my phone. I was in the lobby of the hostel, and there's always like 20 people gathered there just like talking about something. Oh, hey, I did this today and I blah blah, and people just kind of lounging around, and it's just the whole place is a mess. It's also super fun. It's like you get to meet so many really active, fun, happy, fucking attractive people, young people at that hostel. I'm like, I could just live in this hostel forever, So anyway, so I was there, and we were supposed to go out. Like I was supposed to go out with these guys that I met at the hostel in an hour or so, like downtown. It's always party time in Mexico, by the way. It doesn't matter, even if it's Monday evening, the clubs are popping. Okay, so we're planning to go out, and I realized, oh shit, I'm on LSD. My intellectual faculty is not at its best. There are things that I need to do. For example, I need to charge my phone. I need to go up to my room, change into something else that more clubs will let me in, I was like, okay, now you see, here's a little lesson for you, Neil. The intellectual part is important. Okay, so how do we do this? Like, okay, first I need to charge my phone. I'm really in no state to like use my usual faculties of reasoning to find where I put my charger or whatever. I'm running out of time. So all I did, I remember just getting up and saying, I need to charge my phone. And the moment I said, the first thing I see is the power socket, like the power outlet right next to me. And then someone just volunteered. Someone said, you need a charger? And it comes out from under their ass. Like, and this is all in the same second where I first got up with this intention. So, it was just like lying right here. And I take it and I plug it in. And in a couple of seconds from when I first had that idea, and I thought this must be an insurmountable problem now, my phone was charging. And then I remembered the Matrix and the deja vu, about how we just assume that the universe just has this fixed course for the future and it doesn't respond in any way to what you want or whatever. I mean, this ultimate creator has all the power in the world to have simply shifted the trajectory of the universe. And then someone might say, no, they would still have to go back and explain where the charger came from. But maybe they do it in ways where like you can't keep track. Now, if you want to start now figuring out the history, the creator will be like, oh, okay, now I have to like make up some history. And they will be like tampering evidence on the fly, to give you answers of where the charger came from. You can't beat this shit. Okay. So, and I was like, did that thing just like appear out of thin air? Because that's what it felt like. Like, okay, well, I'm not believing anything, but I won't also disbelieve it. So anyway, my charging is being done. Okay. But I think if you ask for nasty things, it doesn't happen. I don't know. I'm not sure. We'll have to find out. Okay. Maybe if you ask for nasty things, it will still happen. It's just another way of like making you confused. Like you thought you could read my mind. Oh, here's whatever. Anyway, so yeah, okay. So theory. Okay. So now that I've kind of given you this like voodoo world that I believe in, it's going to be easier for you to digest this next thing. So given the way that my own personal experiences have been evolving, I grew up in India. When I was a kid, I had these visions, and they kind of went away as I kind of like, I kind of swept them under the rug. I'm like, no, I'm going to be a scientist. There's no place in science for stuff like this. And I did the science thing for a while, and I came to the US. I've been in Austin. Things have been really awesome. I've learned a lot. I've grown a lot as a person. I've experienced so many things, and I did drugs, and I'm kind of coming back to spirituality in multiple ways. Apparently, coincidentally, people have figured out a lot of new kinds of technology that make me ask the same questions, or make it more believable that this simulation model of the world could be true. Humans have started making their own simulations. We have shows on TV like Westworld and stuff, and it is all happening particularly in my slice of the timeline of the universe. Mm-hmm. There could have been so many possible times. If I were to believe the real history of the universe, there could be so many possible times I would have been born, and I wouldn't even have the language to talk about what I'm talking about. I wouldn't have other examples. I wouldn't have a person listening to me about the simulation theory. Things are being handed to me on a silver platter, if this were to be the objective of the universe. So in some ways I feel, okay, all of this like supposed independence of the history of the universe may at some point turn out to be false, and this whole thing is supposed to be my game, and the objective is for me to discern the spell of Maya, and I'm getting the right input and the right stories and whatever. Maybe no one else ever existed, or maybe I have no idea. But all I'm saying is that once again, my error bars about what I believe in have become much bigger as far as the so-called independent universe is concerned, and I'm just a brief visitor. So what I wrote down was that given the way my experiences are developing and coincidental breakthroughs in the development of technology, like the invention of VR, etc., that allowed us to start this conversation, it could all be kind of intentional towards nudging me towards the dispelling of the illusion. I said, if not outright solipsistic, like if not an outright solipsistic view that you don't even exist and this is all for the purpose of me. But I'm not really sure about that. I mean, there's no reason for me to suppose that multiple apparent personalities can't be playing this game, but there's really ultimately no way to know. How does science forget every day that there's so many fundamental things we just can't figure out? But anyway. Okay, so the next question is, if it really is true that the universe had this history for most of which humans were much less civilized than we are now, definitely we are not making simulations of the quality that we are making now. So we were not familiar in our technological, economic, cultural worlds with the idea of simulations. How is it that such ancient traditions hypothesized such a sophisticated idea? Like the ancient Indian traditions, this was like thousands of years BC. They wrote about something that is essentially that the world is some sort of a simulation. A creator created the simulation out of parts of themselves, and they entered it, became multiple characters, but then he will wake up. They didn't use modern terms like simulation or whatever, but they talked about a very similar idea. Mm-hmm. So how is it that they talked about something like this? What prompted them to come up with ideas like Maya? And I think it might be that it doesn't require the invention of simulation in order for you to start questioning if you are in one. One thing that could make you start questioning is if at brief little moments here and there, partially or completely, I wake you from the simulation in various different ways. If you're not fully immersed in the simulation the whole time, then sometimes you might remember like waking up a little bit, whatever that means. And I'm like, hey, I think I kind of got a glimpse of what reality is really like. So for example, the way that I feel when I'm on LSD. In some ways, I've kind of started to repackage or reinterpret that as sort of being closer to truth. Maybe previous traditions did not have access to LSD, but they had access to other drugs, and for whatever reason in this world, if you take certain chemical compounds, you get closer to truth. I don't really know. Maybe it has to do with kind of shaking about the normally rigid way that your brain works, kind of showing you, hey, this is not the only way, and that necessarily is closer to the truth than just believing one thing. Or maybe you don't even need drugs. There could be other ways to lift the veil
I was going
of
to say,
the
like
different illusions.
fasting, meditation.
There's also this thing. So fasting and meditation are what would be called the path of the will in Hinduism. And then there's the path of surrender, which is the path of love and sacrifice, in which you're not like, oh, I need to get to enlightenment, but you simply give yourself up in many different ways. So for example, you spend your entire life in service. You try to get as close to true unconditional love as possible. And I think I have reason to suspect that no matter how little we may know about fasting or meditation or this particular hypnotic, psychedelic, whatever, or that particular ritual or this way of doing meditation, we all kind of intuitively know what it means to love. Not love a particular person, but to immerse ourselves in love. I think we kind of intuitively know. So I think that key or that path is immediately available to everyone. And I'll tell you a little story here. There's this woman called Lisa Kearns who lives in the UK, and she is a teacher of non-duality. And she claims that not permanently, but her brain has shifted into this new mode where the notion of the self is kind of dissolved. This is not always the state of her mind, but it is the case most of the time. And so she goes around talking about, how she sees. She won't say this is how I see reality. She will just say that this is the nature of reality and these are delusions, etc. And she sometimes has this YouTube videos where she's live on YouTube, and you can Skype in using her Skype handle and ask any question, and she will answer them live on the YouTube thing. And I was just doing some work and I was subscribed to her channel, and I suddenly get this email saying, hey, she's live on YouTube. So I go on to see what is going on. I'm like, oh, you can ask questions. So I Skyped in and I asked her a question. Big fan. So it was like a nice moment for me because I had been watching her videos for a long time, and I really liked her videos. So she actually read my question. She was a little dyslexic, and I put long words in the question, and she was like, what is this word? I was like, oh shit, okay. So I asked her, what do you think causes the shift from this apparent duality of I'm a person and everything else is separate to the non-duality? And she said she doesn't know. She said it just happens in some people and it doesn't happen in other people. In the people for whom it happens, sometimes it happens permanently, sometimes it doesn't. It has something to do, she said, it has something to do with the body-mind mechanism, and I don't really know. And if someone could have the answer to that question, then it would be $1 million question, because a lot of people are looking for this. But I don't think anyone knows at the moment what causes this shift. And the second question, and then she said, I said, okay, so but what can I do to have this shift, to experience this shift? And she said, the only thing that I can tell you to do is to follow absolute unconditional love. And I was like, what the fuck? That's such a cheesy, that's never gonna work. We're talking about a neurological shift inside your mind. What does it mean, follow absolute unconditional love? What the fuck does that mean? And I didn't know what the fuck exactly it meant, but some part of me knew a little bit of what the fuck it meant. And that little part of me, I think, has been growing stronger and stronger. And at some point, months later, I actually sent her another message on Skype. I said, I now know what you meant. Because in my own experience, I have realized that following absolute unconditional love is really, I mean, those moments are at least simultaneous with moments of the self disappearing. So it can happen without drugs, it can happen without meditation. And so this is the path of surrender. So there's the path of the will, and there's the path of the surrender. And so there are many devices, I think, accessible to a society which doesn't have things like today's VR or simulation technology to start the conversation with. This conversation, when we use simulation, the idea of simulations or technology, it begins at a very intellectual level. But the conversation doesn't have to begin on an intellectual level if the society does not primarily live their lives on an intellectual level. So once again, it's a bit of a coincidence that I'm an intellectual person, I live an intellectual life, and in my intellectual times, there has been an intellectual or technological phenomenon as sort of that kind of points somewhat coincidentally at what the nature of reality might be. Anyway, I'm seeing clues and footprints everywhere. In a couple of weeks, I'll go crazy. But anyway, so yes. Okay, so I wanted to say, okay, how did ancient traditions come up with the simulation theory? Sometimes the illusion can be lifted. Okay, so here I want to talk a little bit about a little video clip of a different non-duality teacher whose experience was different than Lisa Kern's. His shift was not abrupt like that. I think he grew up in some suburb of the UK, and he said that he had a couple of experiences or visions or whatever when he was a child, and he was just on his bicycle or playing with his little soccer ball. He felt somehow raised beyond just that local context and seeing as if from a bird's eye view, not only himself but everything around him. And in that world, in that moment, he was kind of like, he was kind of the whole local world and not just him. And within that world, he could see himself like playing with this soccer ball, and it just became one of many different characters. So this may have been just this weird illusion that he had, or just this weird trip that he had, but something made him kind of go and seek out more information about what he had just experienced. So he went to a local library, and he actually found the Bhagavad Gita, which is like, one of the, and I think he found one of the Vedas actually, and he eventually came up on the Advaita Vedanta, which is the text about the non-separation between the self and the world. And he eventually kept following it. I don't know the rest of his story, but now he is also a non-duality teacher. So you can imagine that little experience that he had for a few minutes of becoming one with just his whole surroundings and seeing his supposed self as just being one character among many could be a temporary lifting of the grip of the simulation or the illusion or Maya that we are in. And the reasons that it happens or whether it's real, I mean, I don't really know. So experiences and insights like these could be the ones that fueled old traditions to write down theses like this. And also, I guess it helped that there was not such a rigidly laid down perspective, like a scientific perspective on how to view the world. Like people weren't constantly, no, that's not scientific, so you can't talk about this, blah, blah. In today's world, you have to kind of struggle against that in the beginning before you can really start talking about this experience. And most times it will be shut down anyway. Which at this point, or at any point, our podcast listeners have been free to do. Or apparently free to do. Okay. Also, have you heard of this TED Talk called My Stroke of Insight?
I don't think so.
There's a neuroscientist who underwent a stroke that resulted from a bleeding inside her brain. And I think it kind of temporarily shut down the language
the Speed Center.
I've heard about this, but I haven't watched the TED Talk.
And she gave this TED Talk about how in those moments where she was like really trying to call 911, or she couldn't talk, she couldn't recognize objects, all very useful things. But in those moments, she felt like she was at one with the universe, and there was complete and utter bliss. So in the moments that the 911, like they were coming for her, she was just enjoying this shower, and she was like, wow, this is the best thing that has ever happened to me. So there are multiple ways in which this supposed illusion can be lifted. I think I'll talk a little bit more about the connection between language and the notion of the separate self, and why it may not be a coincidence that the bleeding was near her language center. But that will be in like the different podcast episode that I do about non-duality. Anyway, so okay, over here I kind of wrote down once again, like, is this lifting of the illusion, did this lifting of the illusion happen because of the anomalous bleeding in the brain, or is it correlated with this observed bleeding in the brain as another means to distract you? I mean, she's a neuroscientist, so now a lot of other people take her experience very seriously, but they may be led down the wrong rabbit hole of, oh, this is something that's just particular way that the brain settles into this mode when there's a bleeding next to the language center, and it really has nothing to do and should have no bearing on your spiritual life or how you regard the universe, blah blah. So I think it's never supposed to be very easy for us humans, no matter how many times this happens, the lifting of the veil. I don't think it's meant for us humans to be easy to end the game. At least, I mean, your experiences can't very easily become someone else's experience.
Well, and I wonder even to what extent your own experiences ought to propagate forward. Like if you have your own, moments where you feel like the veil has been lifted.
Yeah.
How tied are you to that? Can you like?
Yeah.
Then go on to live the rest of your life in total denial of that, or like
I don't think there is any dictum. I don't think that so one of the fundamental ideas of like the big religions is the idea of heaven and hell, and that if you fuck up, you go to hell. Like if this is supposed to be the objective of the game, and you live your entire life as this really separate, egoistic individual, just amassing money and power and abusing people and saying fuck you to love all the time, that therefore you will have to burn in hell. I don't think there's any such thing. I think there is no question of being forgiven or whatever. It's just this game arising out of nothing, and it would be no fun if everyone always did the right thing. So I mean, it's kind of deliberate. The pitfalls are deliberate. And if ultimately everyone is the same thing, which is the same thing as a creator, this was all intended all along. So what you do or not do as a result of these experiences, it's what you do. But depending on what you do, your further experiences are going to be different. That I can guarantee you. So there seems to be some kind of a thinly veiled system of reward and punishment associated, but I don't know. So if you ask me, I feel like what I want to do is continue to lift this veil of separation, because I have seen in my own life that effort being rewarded with happiness and joy, unconditional joy. And so I'm like, I'm just going to keep doing this. But if that has not been someone else's experience, then they're helplessly bound to their own destiny of doing something different. So, okay. So, Okay, so my last bullet point was about, if this is a game of some sort, then let's talk a little bit about what kind of game it is. But we have already talked about several features. This podcast has mostly been about the nature of the simulation that I think we are in and what kind of game it is. But a couple other points that I want to talk about is, so we did say that it's not easy to win, within quotes, this game. It's not even easy to know the objective of what the game of life is about.
It's not easy to know what to do. It's not easy at all to be happy. Humankind, every year, they find something out that, this is going to make us happy forever. I don't think on average, despite leaps and bounds in technological innovation, we are on average any happier than the cave person was. And I don't think it's not meant to be easy. And also, I don't think happiness is the objective of the game, although it can be correlated. It can be one of the objectives. But if you try to obtain happiness through a shortcut such that you're not paying attention to the other objectives of the game, then you'll notice that you don't get happiness either. For example, if you want to get happiness without wanting to make other people happy, if you want to get happiness without sharing love, it's not easy. If you want to get happiness selfishly, it always eludes you. And I think it's kind of written in not in the natural laws of the game, but the psychological laws of the game. And science today is not concerned about writing down the psychological laws of how the mind interacts. People practicing meditation can write down some phenomenological laws for you. And one of them is that, happiness is not easy to get. And when you really crave happiness, on the other side of that is aversion, and it's just this thing. You are just caught on a treadmill. So that's one, I think, somewhat designed principle of the game, that it's not supposed to be easy. No easy answer to moral and ethical questions, which is why the whole fields exists. But even in your own life, you can't always inherit the right answer from things that you have read. It is a very particular personal choice in every moment. And even after you make the choice, in a lot of cases, you'll not be certain that you made the right choice. I think it's because this is not a simple game based on simple right and wrong choices. Also, I used to think earlier at the beginning of my newfound spiritual quest that spiritual answers ought to be easy, within quotes. That if I'm not finding an easy answer that I immediately like and I go with, I'm like, yeah, this is the right answer, then it's not a good answer, or I'm doing something wrong. I'm getting spirituality wrong. I'm doing something wrong. But in some ways lately, especially since I started kind of thinking of life as this game that is deliberately challenging, I've kind of become relaxed about the fact that decisions or choices in my life are hard. And I'm like, it wasn't up to me. I didn't decide to make this choice hard. I'm just kind of find myself in a cocktail of incidents and happenings and conditions in which every step seems to be hard. Well, so be it. This is the nature of the game. Okay? So I've kind of started to relax my notion that things ought to be simple. But kind of funnily, that relaxation itself has made things kind of simple, because I'm not so strongly tied to what is going to happen if I get this thing fucking wrong. That idea has kind of started to recede in my head, that there's really like the one consciousness thing, just do what you want. Not really, but whatever. Okay. So yeah, so I followed it up with saying that the relief of, this whole big problem, every step is like, whoa, this game is so hard to play, god damn it. But the relief lies in the fact that if you stop worrying about the right thing to do in this game, because such a thing only exists when fabricated by your mind, then the game is immediately engaging at every step. When you're not looking for that score in the corner, then the game is, what you get in return for giving up your quest for a score is the game. And the game is immediately engaging. Every moment, then it becomes its own purposeless reward, whether that moment goes positively or negatively. And I think this has connections with how the Buddhists say that, don't go for the craving or aversion, just let things be as they are. Okay, so at the very end, I kind of, drawing on all of these, there are roughly two kinds of games in economy. For example, there's a zero-sum game where if someone wins, the person loses. And then there's a non-zero-sum game where everyone in the end, maybe some people lose, but the overall winning is non-zero. And I think if life is a game, to me, I can very strongly start to see that it's a non-zero-sum game. And in that lies whatever meaning I find in this apparently chaotic, purposeless phenomenon, is that there is a source of something. And that source, that ultimately non-zero-sum source, whatever it is producing, if you'll notice carefully, if there is any non-zero-sum anywhere, then it is love. It is some form of love. So the economy, for example, right now it's boosting and everyone's getting something. So we imagine it's non-zero sum game, but we're not calculating the sum across everything. For example, we are not taking into account the impact on the environment, on the planet, and whatever. So if you take something that involves a certain number of entities, and we see what was the total sum across all of them, I think the sum is equal to love, and everything else is not love. And for me, in many ways, that is the purpose of the game now for me. I actually recently changed my WhatsApp status to say I'm into non-zero sum games. But for me now, it's kind of like an orienting principle. Is right now, today, or during this course, or during this interaction with this person, or in this career decision, or in the next few months, or in this particular gathering of friends, what is the source, or what is a good source of non-zero-ness in the sum? This is a game, so let's not forget about the game part. Let's have fun, but can I contribute to the non-zero sum of this game here? And that ultimately for me like makes the game a lot better. And if you notice, it's non-zero sum, so it makes the game better for everyone and at no cost to anyone. So ultimately I think, so this true unconditional love that Lisa Kearns told me about is something that does not play by the rules of any zero-sum game. It ultimately is kind of boundless and forever giving, and it's sort of also the other word for, so non-duality people say that when the duality or the separation ceases, you can call what remains, the one thing that remains, by many names. You can call it God or truth or beauty or Brahman or whatever, but you can also call it absolute unconditional love. And I didn't have any idea what they meant. At the time I was thinking of it starting from the point of view of dry neuroscience, like the model of the self, and how it might be an illusion and things that might be achieved when you, I was like, what does this have to do with absolute unconditional love? But now all the pieces are kind of starting to click together, not in intellectual ways that I can necessarily explain to someone, but in ways that I can feel that sound true and make sense. So you can go about your life pretending like it's a zero-sum game, and life will give you back evidence after evidence that it is a zero-sum game. Or you can go about life as if it's a non-zero-sum game, and every step will be filled with non-zero-sum rewards. So I mean, it's a pretty interesting game. It can be what you want it to be, but then do you really end up wanting it to be anything? Because free will is an illusion. Who knows? It's ultimately fun. I'm enjoying it, even if I'm on the passengers. I have no idea. Whatever. That's the very confused conclusion of what of what I had to say. Oh, one other thing. I made a little note here to say something specific about the shrooms trip that I had. And I remember writing down during the shrooms trip that this is non-dual. But what I wrote following that was also important. I said, this is non-dual, but it does not matter. Love is the only thing that matters. And I spoke to a guy yesterday, actually, in the bike trip, who said that he feels the same way on shrooms. And when I'm on shrooms, I can't remember what kind of person I am on shrooms. But I do remember my actions, things that I did. Every 15 minutes or so, I would pop out of nowhere. Here in this very room where I did shrooms with a couple of friends, I would like pop out of nowhere and say things like, did I remind you guys that love is all that matters? So it's kind of funny that that first shrooms trip was where love for me got in the chain of cause, effect, and importance. Initially, I had the scientific notion of the world where at the root of everything is what the fundamental particles are doing, so fundamental physics, and then it gives rise to chemistry, gives rise to biology, and to a subset of biological beings that have the necessary hardware to run like complicated programs like our psychology, and then a subset of the psychology is love. So it's at the tail fucking end of the causative chain. There's no reason to go looking at it if you're looking to find the core of what the universe is about. But on that shroom strip, I had this very strong sensation that love appeared to me to be at the very source as opposed to at the very end of things. It appeared to me to be a guiding or generating principle. And I remember that wasn't an intellectual deduction. It was just this feeling that I was unquestionably in. Oh, love seems to be like the most important thing. And everything else needs to be understood as being derived from love. All the way down to fucking the atoms, maybe. I don't know. So I mention it now because at the very end I was just saying that, if it's a game and you have no fucking way of figuring out what it's all about, and there's all this confusion, but what kind of stabilizes me in this storm of ideas of what everything is about, in this chaos and uncertainty, is just focus on the non-zero sum, and that's love. So yeah, the ideas kind of are clicking together. Concluding thoughts?
Do I have any concluding thoughts?
You can tell me about, I know it's about like 6:14 and they're probably about to call for dinner, but you can tell me about any experiences or thoughts in your own personal life that have any bearing or any connection with whatever we have talked about in these 2 episodes that you haven't mentioned yet.
Well, I definitely feel like I've had prolonged periods of time in my life where it felt like, by and large, I was like, so when I like, stopped playing violin, that was like a pretty deeply integrated facet of my identity. Right, like that was just, as long as I'd known, that was the thing everyone who knew me relative to, right? Like that was like the first thing that they would latch onto. So in many ways, it was something I not only associated with myself, but I associated with like the entire world's projection of who I was. And so there were, I think in the months following that, there were just what you were describing about the world appearing rich and intense and alive. That was very, very true.
In the months following what?
That I'd stopped playing violin, that I like had dropped out of school, and that I was I moved into an apartment with no Wi-Fi where I lived by myself, and so I was like very much like I guess attempting to wake myself up, sort of, in a sense, in a sense that like it was like, okay, well, I'd had this just heavy like drape in front of my eyes of a narrative of stories of all these things about what life was supposed to look like for me, that I was trying to get rid of. And so in the absence of those things, it wasn't that like, it wasn't scary. It was like, I wasn't like gung-ho about it every day. I was like, God. But on the other side of that usually was this intense appreciation for just the most ostensibly banal things. Like I would spend like 45 minutes, just like chopping vegetables really slowly, just like and I was like, I wouldn't spice my foods very much because like these flavors are so intense, and it's like
nice,
and it's like
your attention was also in multiple things now instead of just being funneled
right.
Well, this one thing.
Well, it was my I was no longer preoccupied with this sort of like fabricated notion, but instead trying to be more just an observer of what it was like to just be existing at a pretty basic level. And that was more than adequate. It was again, like, it was very vibrant. It was very enjoyable. It was cool. And I was like, wow, we don't like I don't know what the fuck was I doing, like
you told yourself that this is the one thing that is going to make you supremely and absolutely happy,
and it's like way far down the road, and I just gotta sweat and bleed and do all the other stuff before I get there. And then I was like, oh, like just I was just swimming through more than I could ever want, and being totally ignorant of it, just by merit of how I was framing the world, and my place in it. I don't know. I think I approached it with like a fair amount of discipline, probably relative to the normal person, just because that was still a habit of mine at the time. I think.
I mean, there's a place for discipline. I think everything has a place if you know how to use it in the right context, given your intention.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, and that's why, like, you know, it's so interesting. I at that point in time in my life, I was also very interested in cultivating some sort of sense or notion of spirituality, right? Of connection with this thing that
How
we're in.
old were you at this time?
20.
Okay, that's when you stopped playing. Okay.
Yeah, so this is like four years ago. Feels like forever ago. I don't know.
It's a good thing, I think.
Maybe, yeah. And so I was. Yeah, I guess I was trying to be. Well, okay, a few things. I felt like violin provided a nice analogy because it was like this, like, not particularly difficult to conceive of thing to obtain a high proficiency at, and yet, you know, you can see someone else do it, but to replicate it yourself requires years and years of training, a very conscientious, deliberate training. You know, not just sort of like half-assing it. There's a in the realm of all things you could be doing with a violin under your neck, there's a very small subset of ones that will be effective.
I see.
Right.
Okay.
And so with that saying, I took that as an axiomatic assumption about most things, and said, okay, what can I generalize from that and say might also be true then for cultivating a sense of abiding happiness and contentment in my own life. Right? Like there's probably like a small subset of all the possible things that I could be doing in my life that actually do bring me. I guess I was thinking of it in sort of like maybe non-zero sum, but along a temporal scale. Like what can I do now that is not like, you know, awful, but will also benefit me in the future. So it's just like those things that are good for me now and will be good for me tomorrow and will be good for me 10 years from now. If it like satisfies those things, then like those are like the things worth cultivating. So I was kind of reluctant to put language on things before I needed it. You know, try as much as possible to wait and observe and just try and rekindle a sense of what my experiences were personally, as opposed to immediately trying to generalize them to some sort of communicable label, that I think is often the trend, or the tendency when we're trying to learn new things. But I think can especially if the realm of interest is that of our own experiences, that can just be kind of that maybe is something more interesting to the person trying to teach it, but not necessarily to the person trying to cultivate an experiential practice themselves. And I did start doing a lot of meditation at the time and some yoga as well. So I don't know that it's interesting. I guess it's like, it's hard to say whether I was really successful in cultivating a sense of like non-duality, or just had done well in cultivating an environment that stimulated only less dualistic thinking. Right? Does that make any sense?
I mean, I think this idea of non-duality is not black and white.
Mm-hmm.
You can have, or you can create conditions for some sort of like a partial expression of it.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, because like I guess I guess because I guess non-duality is something about how you relate to your experiences, right? It's an interpretation you kind of just don't engage in. So I think I was aware of like, you know, you can't immediately be put into like trench warfare and expect to become the Buddha right off the bat, right? Like that might not be the best place to do it.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, well, or maybe where are better places to do that? So I was kind of just conscientious about what types of environments I was subjecting myself to, so that I could use those to remind me and also help facilitate that practice.
Yeah.
And then it all got much harder because I went back to school.
Yeah, I see. And now here we are.
And now here we are. Yeah.
That was a good recap of Benam's origin story.
Yeah. Well, so I guess your question is like experiences I've had, because I've also done LSD a few times, but I don't know that I've done enough. I usually take usually half a dose.
Mm-hmm.
The most I've taken is one tab, and that was I gave myself like in two separate halves, like not at the same time. So like my trips have never been bad enough where I like legitimately visually hallucinated. There was never any sort of
mine neither.
Okay.
Well, I've had like slight non-intense visual hallucinations in both times. But it may not simply have to do with the dose,
right?
Because I got the same dose, I think, both times that I did LSD, and in the second time my experiences and my interpretation of those experiences were, I think I wouldn't say more intense, but different, much closer to these ideas that I'm talking about. My interpretations were, and more intense, more happy. Not more intense, but more happy. And so what was the difference? The difference was that I was a different person. The second time, if a man steps twice into, what's the thing?
Oh, you can't step into the same river twice.
Yeah, you can't step into the same river twice. I think this time the river was the same, but the person was different. Yeah. Sometimes the river is a little bit different depending on where the LSD was like manufactured or whatever. But in some ways, even going into the trip this time in Mexico City, I kind of knew that it would be different, and that I had much less reason to worry, for example, and that just alone can shape so much what your trip is going to be like, what you're going to experience, what you're going to think about. You know, just going into it, how do you feel? If you feel worried, you're not going to get the same thoughts and ideas. Yeah, so I think dosage does determine to some extent what you're going to feel, but it's also like your own chemistry and your own psychological makeup.
Yeah, these are all interesting. I do remember as a child having one. I also did not enjoy thinking about death. It was like what you're describing, out like a sense of like paralyzing fear from it. I would get that chronically, and I hated it. And it was maybe one of the reasons I enjoyed like games as distractions, right? Because it's like they are these like immersive things that we can escape into and sort of forget our like larger context. And so I remember as a kid, trying to imagine what infinity is, right? Like, what is, like, because in Christian theology, like, you if you win, you go to heaven and you're stuck there forever. Yeah. And I was like, wait a minute. Wait, I mean, you're like, I can't get out. Like, I'm like like forever. And so I was like trying to imagine that. And I had this like visual of just these, like, you know, I don't know why, molten golden comets just like careening through space, and it just like didn't stop, and it just like kept going. And I'm like, I was like, yeah, this just sounds awful. I mean, and you know, the alternative's not better because you just die, right? Like, so it's like I couldn't reconcile that there was a better alternative. Both were terrifying to me.
Well, one of those experiences can't be evaluated because you're dead.
Right.
And the other is evaluated to be infinitely and endlessly boring.
Exactly.
Which do you pick?
I know. Yeah. I know. It's like this is shit. I mean, yeah. To me, what by far is most surprising is that people derive any sense of contentment or like assuage any of their fear by the notion of heaven. To me, I'm like, no. Yeah. Do not. Do whatever. I don't even like just. There's
if you
no
keep
way.
like wiping the person's memory in periodic intervals, if they feel like being born every year or something, then okay.
But that's just as awful, right? I mean, it's like you're repeatedly just. I mean, if you have no memory, what's the difference between that and being dead? You know,
it's like no difference. So, which is why I was kind of hoping that he would come to this. Maybe death is not to be feared as much. Maybe it is just a way to keep living forever, but without being bored.
The original simulators was like we got to like around humans would get to around like 500 600 years old and we just like start ripping our own eyeballs out. They're like we should probably just kill them. Like they don't seem happy at all.
Yeah. That's a good one. So okay, so you used to be afraid of that.
Yeah, one. And then I guess I got old enough to realize that there are even more potent distractions than games, and so I think I mean, I can very clearly pinpoint the time in my life when I decided to get quote unquote serious about the violin, because I was like in a shower, scrubbing my hair. This was at a music camp in the Czech Republic, and my grandmother just passed away, and my sister had just spent the last like 6 months combating her cancer, and so I was like, just like there's like I was seeing the presence of mortality everywhere, and I was like, oh my god, like I could just drop dead tomorrow. What have I done with my life? Like, what a waste. So I in a desperate fit of grasping for the nearest thing that I thought I could control, I was like, okay, like what's the thing I can make the biggest, fastest dent in terms of like just people recognizing me, feeling accomplished, getting like praise and whatever. And so I was like, violin. Okay, I guess this is what we're doing for now, because like this is what it appears to be that I'm best at, and it's a small enough dominion that I could maybe be competitive compared to other people in it. Of course that didn't work out, because eventually like about a year later I was in that car accident. I was like, can't even control this shit. This is this is wild.
How would you rate your fear of death now as compared to like when you were a kid, like you were describing?
I mean, now it's. Back then, like the fear was like full body physiological, right? It was like head to toe hot, like just an awful physical visceral reaction. I think now, it's kind of like how I don't tend to think too much about like logically absurd statements like this sentence is false. Yeah. I'm also like, well, yeah, there's that death thing, and I've thought about it a lot, and I don't feel
there's
like
nothing to be done
yeah
about.
Yeah, I'm like I could be thinking about that, or there's a lot of other things that I could spend my time thinking about that just more exciting. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's a nice. It's like what you were saying. It's like even for those people who get sucked into like the artificial games of like acquiring status, money, or wealth or whatever, like at the end of the line we all have this thing waiting for us which resets the score to 0, and that to me is actually a very nice thing about death, because it's like, you know, when I do remember it, I'm like, I'm not scared. I'm like, oh wow, I need to realign how I've been framing my life, because right now I got it all skewed and out of whack, and I think in the presence of our own mortality, like the things that are important become obviously important, and everything else becomes unimportant. And by and large,
there is only one time in my life where I remember thinking about the fear of death, thinking about whether I'm feeling afraid of death, and coming up with the answer, no, I'm not feeling afraid of death. And I was on ecstasy, I was on MDMA at that time. I don't think it's a coincidence that it's supposed to be this empathogen where it kind of erodes your ego. So I mean, that's once again a clue to where the fear of death comes from. Certain subcategory of processes in your mind that are constantly creating the notion of the self as separate from others. On that note, we are gonna end this. There's no other better.
The way you phrased that made it sound kind of like a suicide pact or something.
No, we're done, and I need to pee.
Thank you for joining our long journey today in the Room of Lives. Hope to see you soon, and take care and have fun until we meet again.